Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics.
The tragedy of Grenfell Tower casts a long shadow over housing quality in Britain, and while thankfully there have been no repeat incidents on such a horrific scale, there is no shortage of horror stories related to construction, delivery and build of new homes across Wales. New industries have surged, such as Swansea's new homes quality control, because the state of new build housing is variable to say the least, and matters of post-Grenfell Tower block safety and the ongoing scourge of unreformed leaseholding in Wales and England paints a poor picture of our house building culture. So why is the industry so structurally unsound? What can be done, and how can we insulate home buyers from mistakes made in the past? To discuss this tonight, we are joined by Sam Rees, Senior Public Affairs Officer for Wales at the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors.
Thank you very much.
And Mark Thomas. Mark is Chair of the Celestia Management Company Limited and spokesperson for the Welsh Gladiators Campaign Group.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you this evening. Diolch.
No, it's great. This has been an issue. Well, housing is a massive issue in Wales, and the issue around cladding has certainly been at the forefront of the media for the last couple of years. But before we look into some of the details of this, can you just both introduce yourselves and the organisations you're representing here tonight? Because they are quite important. Sam, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors is one of those big civic institutions which people hear of but don't know a lot about. Can you tell us a little bit more about the organisation?
Yeah, of course. So the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors was founded over 150 years ago, with the largest professional body of its kind in the UK, working within the residential property sector on professional surveys. So we have several tens of thousands of members working within this space in different capacities, some doing your residential valuations, part of home surveys. A lot of people will come across us when they're trying to buy or sell a house. We also, on top of the survey bit, do the residential valuations as well, which help produce expertly formed and market evidenced property valuations. On top of that, we've got members who work in different capacities as well. So when we talk about building safety, a significant portion of our members work within the building surveying sector as well. So, of course, working on issues like cladding, but broader fire safety issues, broader structural issues as well. So we're really integrated as part of the broader Welsh housing and Welsh built environment sector as well. And from my perspective, I'm, as Kerry has said, the Senior Public Affairs Officer within Wales. So I pick up all of our residential policy work. I work very closely with local authorities, with Welsh Government, other industry bodies, and importantly, consumer groups, as we call them, industry sort of sector representatives as well, to really try to understand what are the important issues on the ground and actually where can we, within our, albeit narrow field, help support.
That's great. Thanks, Sam. And Mark, I think the intro might have given a clue to where you are in all this, but can you tell us a bit around your background in this sector?
My role really has been as a customer, or otherwise known as a victim of the industry. So I'm a leaseholder. I bought a property off Redrow back in 2007, which I thought was a high value added, quality, prestigious property. Post Grenfell, I discovered that I purchased a house of horrors, and that forced me to then get engaged. So I originally became involved in a protest group at Celestia who was trying to get political and regulatory action around it, and also deal with the developer in question. That subsequently got me elected as a director and subsequent chairman of the Celestia Management Company. I'm elected by other leaseholders in the development to represent their interests and to manage the development on a day-to-day basis. We appoint a professional managing agent to do the day-to-day running, but we have overall responsibility for the finances and the well-being of the development. And as the years have gone on, as we've faced continued obstruction and difficulties in getting anything done, that led me with a few other people to form the Welsh Gladiators, which was really an attempt and an effort to bring other developments across Wales, although principally the epicenter of the crisis is obviously in Cardiff Bay and Swansea. There are a few outliers in Newport and a bit further west, but the real epicenter of the crisis is in Cardiff Bay and Swansea. And we put together the Welsh Gladiators as an attempt to try and pull together other developments of a similar size that were experiencing problems. So I wear kind of two hats, but it's exposed me to all the many industry actors. So Sam's Ricks, freeholders, many lawyers, regulatory authorities, South Wales Fire and Rescue. There's a cast of thousands in this crisis, and I've come to interact with them. But essentially, I come from a non-building industry background. Most of my career has been spent internationally with large corporations across a range of other business areas. But in a nutshell, that's where I come from.
No, I think that's great. I think you can give that perspective from those people who are living with some of these post-Grenfell problems. But before we go too further into the show, we should probably have a sense check on the situation and what it's actually like at the moment. Is it as bad as it's painted across the whole of Wales? Sam, where are we with the overarching house building landscape in Wales?
Yeah, so I think there's two challenges here to address. One, the existing housing stock, the 1.5 million existing properties we have, and also the new build demand as well. Looking at the new build side of things, the Welsh Government under Mark Drakeford and the original government under the previous election came in and said we're going to build 20,000 affordable homes. Note the use of the language here, 20,000 affordable homes, in contrast to the UK government's 300,000 house building target. There's very little to distinguish within that 300,000 target what they deem as affordable, what's the designation here, sort of across 10 years. In Wales, that 20,000 affordable target has certainly had challenges. The current sort of Minister for Housing and Planning, Julie James, has said it is still her commitment to achieve that 20,000 target. It's going in the right direction, albeit since that target was hit, sort of target was set, we've had a lot of challenges. COVID in particular, inflation, neutrality as well, and sort of broader planning challenges as well has really impacted that 20,000 target. But things going in the right direction, and just on the broader challenge of sort of new build supply as well. Obviously, big challenges around the quality of new build supply. Certain elements are regulated, things like the Welsh Housing Quality Standard, the Welsh Development Quality Requirement as well. But there is a broader challenge around first-time buyers. How can they get onto the marketplace? What sort of homes they're purchasing? No doubt we'll touch on new build homes sort of further down the line in this discussion. The bigger challenge is the existing house building stock. 1.5 million existing properties in Wales. Quickly summarize, Wales has some of the oldest housing stock, not just in the UK, but in Europe. Mark has quite usefully summarised some of the big challenges when it comes to fire safety, cladding in particular, but broader fire and building safety issues as well, which need addressing. We've obviously got to discuss decarbonisation, climate change, energy efficiency within this existing building stock as well. How is it funded? How can we ensure these properties are safe as well? Increasing stories and you're hearing about damp and mould. And then that sits sort of within the broader, sort of small p political framework going on as well. Things like leaseholder reform, potential renters reform as well in Wales. And how does that all come together to create an effective housing market as well? So to sort of quickly summarise as well, I was speaking to ITV a couple of weeks ago and they asked sort of, are you optimistic about 2024? And it was quite interesting. When we look at the statistics, more houses are coming onto the market. Buyer interest is increasing. The ratio of earnings to house prices is coming down, albeit very, very slowly, but coming down slowly in Wales. So for those looking to purchase, the market is moving in the right direction. But as I said, there's a broader series of challenges we need to address.
I think, Sam, that's a really good summary of where we are. And Mark, I know you've got a very specific part of the housing sector which you're focused on, but can you just tell us a little bit about the good, the bad, and the ugly of your experience of that?
I'm gonna have to say it's been pretty much all very bad. I think you know, when I was a customer back in 2007, I thought, as I said originally, I thought I was buying a high quality, prestigious property, and to discover in 2017 that I basically bought a house of horrors was quite shocked. And along with a lot of other people I speak, their first reaction was to say, I didn't think you could build this rubbish, because there was a perception that a guy from the local authority came around and inspected the site and said, hey, you haven't put a fire break there, or you haven't done that correctly, you need to fix it. And then woe below, we discover that decades of successive deregulation and outsourcing had effectively destroyed that regime. And you basically had developers and builders, in many cases, marking their own homework, which is why we now have across both England and Wales tens of thousands of properties that basically lack the most basic fire protection measures, such as fire breaks in the external wall, flammable cladding. And it comes back from those fundamental defects, I think, in terms of builders, developers were allowed to get away with it. I mean, it's astonishing. And I think it's shocked many people who have realized what was going on and had no idea of it.
Mark, I'm interested to get your view on what is being done in Wales and the rest of the UK with regards to improving the standards of housing.
What I would say from my experience, that I think there is a sort of cultural deficit in the industry, in that one of the things I've slowly learned over the last few years is that if you look at the leaders of many of the people on the development side, and they wield massive power in the industry because they employ people that Sam represents, they employ builders, and they have massive power, they employ architects, etc. A lot of them are populated by accountants, and it's a bit the old analogy between Germany, for example, who I think Sam might correct me, I'm not an expert on Germany, but I've been there a lot of time, who build quite good quality homes, the same as if you go to Scandinavia and the Nordics. They don't seem to have a problem with building well-insulated quality homes. And what you see in England, and I've realized that if you look at a lot of developers' boards, they're populated by accountants, not engineers. You get, in my experience, the odd building surveyor on the board, but they're all sort of financial engineers and mechanics. And I'm always reminded, some of you might remember that famous quote from John Glenn, the astronaut, who joked once that when he goes up in space, he sits at the top of the rocket and thinks, I'm sitting on 2 million parts that have all been built by the lowest cost bidder. And I think that what happens in the developers industry, which leads to quality, is they're obsessed, which I understand, with shareholder value. And whilst they pay a lot of lip service to quality and so forth, the actual reality is it takes second place to drive in their profit margins. I mean, if you look in the last decade, I understand developers have made over 32 billion in profits. And I think to some extent, I always believe in organizations and markets, a fish rots from the head. And I think that's where you have to have a look at. And I worry, and I think it's important to mention, we had a lot of regulation back in 2007 and a lot of standards and procedures when all these defective homes were being built. So I think the band-aid of let's have more regulation, I'm not against that. I think we do need to tighten up. But will that fix the problem? I'm not sure. I think we need something much more fundamental in terms of a shifting culture, and we need to value the engineers more and not always pay homage to Excel and spreadsheets, which I think is a big issue in the house building industry.
Dan, what's your view on the role of the governments, both Welsh and UK, and well, Scottish as well, in terms of tackling some of these issues?
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't throw out a quote as good as John Glenn. But actually, Mark raised a really interesting point about sort of it's almost that not that sort of race to the bottom being led by that financial figure. Sort of anecdotally, a couple of months ago, I did a architectural walking tour of Rome, and it was amazing. Actually, just when you think of a beautiful city like Rome, their town planners, their city planners, their architects, almost entirely were artists by profession, and that says something about the quality and the beauty of some of the buildings, which, quite frankly, have been around for several hundred, if not 1,000 years, and are still in pretty good condition. It's fair to say. Turning to your point about sort of the role of UK government, the role of Welsh government as well, Mark's touched on there is certainly a role of regulation. Regulation will go so far. Regulation should uphold the best quality standards, ensure that the work is completed to a satisfactory position, signed off, and it should be, as Mark has alluded to, almost signed off almost from an impartiality perspective as well, where there is no direct conflict of interest in ensuring that the work is to get signed off there. And to an extent, that's where the role of people like RCS come into the discussion as well, because we can bring in that sort of impartial assessment piece. Work is ongoing, of course, at UK level and Welsh Government level. At the UK level, we've got the Building Safety Act now as well. Within Wales, we've got the Welsh Building Safety Bill progressing, albeit probably slower than I think most people would have ideally liked it to be in. But I would say that Welsh Government, for example, are really sort of in a unique position to go beyond what's happening across the border. So Mark may well be aware Welsh Government are funding now those sort of external cladding surveys on any 11-metre plus building in Wales, which falls within scope, but it's going beyond that as well. It's not just looking at cladding like they're doing in England, but they're also looking at internal features, things like compartmentation, fire doors, fire suppression, sprinklers, evacuation routes, etc. And I can understand Welsh Government absolutely the right decision here. UK government, I admittedly, a slightly more difficult position given the sheer scale of the housing sector in England. But as these surveys progress, lessons are being learned, faults are being discovered. I can't get into the conversation about who's to blame right now. I'm not really privy to any of that information. But there is certainly an argument to be had about sort of that process of building control, signing off, ensuring sort of the person responsible, as it were, is sort of remediating. And a lot of developers in Wales are now on board with that work. Mark, I know Redrow, for example, within the press a couple of days ago about their Cardiff schemes as well. And I would say as well, just the Building Safety Act sort of is improving the sort of registration and the regulation of building control in Wales, which helps to underpin that sort of fundamental inspection of buildings. The deadline for registration was set for April this year, and fundamentally what we heard was almost the vast majority of building control officers currently working in local authorities would be left in a position where they either just walk away or move their expertise outside of local authority control, given the sheer stress they were under to meet that deadline. In Wales, the Welsh Government appreciated that and have been a bit more accommodating, extending the deadline, extending that transitionary period, absolutely not compromising on the quality aspect, but understanding sort of that individual perspective. Actually, some of the controls they put in place, quite rightfully, but within such a tight time frame, was going to drive out a lot of experts who are, at the end of the day, responsible for inspecting these buildings and ensuring there's going to be a stronger regulatory framework going forward.
Do you think we have an issue with new builds in Wales? I think we've all heard horror stories coming out of new build estates. I know a lot of friends of my sort of age, when looking to buy their sort of first houses, are all shying away from new builds and looking for slightly older properties. Do you think the situation is as bad as it first appears, and what can we be doing to tackle this?
Yeah, so I think importantly, something I would stress that new build or existing build property, always helpful to get a home survey completed. RICS, obviously the largest sort of body in the industry supporting this through our home surveys. Other parties sort of exist as well, but it sort of helps provide that sort of impartial piece of the process. And I flagged that up with new builds because it's pretty common in new builds that buyers effectively work off the site manager signing off report, where a lot of these will often say there's one or two nicks to the property, but at the end of the day, you've got to also appreciate the site manager was responsible for having to build that development in the first place. So as you can appreciate, there is certainly a degree of conflict there. There has also been a broader challenge with new builds in terms of the sheer scale, the pace to get these built. Material costs and inflation have taken an impact as well, labour shortages as well. So really having to stretch the skill set going into these buildings. I'm not necessarily blaming the individuals here, but given the pace we're working towards to actually get properties built, we certainly need to sort of increase the supply and the skill set going into the sector. Similarly as well, we sort of shot ourselves in the foot, as it were, across the UK, but still ongoing in Wales with schemes like Help to Buy and the Help to Buy Wales Equity Scheme, which, on the face of it, fantastic, offers great support to first-time buyers. But the unintended consequence is these schemes are being developed exclusively for new build developments. So that locks out 1.5 million existing properties and puts in a massive strain on new build developments to get built quicker to actually meet this demand. I would just say, so I purchased my house a couple of years ago, and when we were weighing up all the different sort of options to purchase, Help to Buy, and we were looking at sort of that new build scale. And yes, there were one or two developments in Cardiff being built. Plasda, a great one, also by Pompeii, which is sort of where I'm from as well, come on the marketplace. But actually around that time, they launched back in 2018, 2019, I think it were, the Lifetime ISA scheme, which is a very similar scheme to Help to Buy, but actually is open to existing build properties as well. So that sort of helped alleviate some of that pressure. That's sort of a whistle-stop tour, some of the new build challenges we're facing.
Mark?
Yeah, again, I'm going to sort of come slightly from a different view. I wouldn't touch a new build at all. If I was buying a property in Cardiff, I'd be trying to get into Roath, Whitchurch or Splot, because those houses have been around for decades, and I think you don't have to be a lover of town planning to drive around some of these new build sites, and you think they just look like toy town houses, and you think, and they often, for example, we all know they're totally inadequate car parking provision. Now I know that takes us into another debate, but you see cars parked up on the pavements. There's no provision for that. And again, I think one of the things I've realized, and this is partly looking at our case and talking to others, is it's quite an incestuous industry. So where you have things like the Home Builders Federation and the insurance scheme, what is it? Sam will correct me if I get this wrong, but it's the NHBC who give you an insurance. It's basically an organization run and controlled by developers, and it's an industry that likes to tell itself how good it is. And I think there was a famous situation a few years ago where Persimmon got into lots of trouble because their CEO had some enormous bonus going into tens of millions, and yet it was racking up customer complaints. And they hired a big KC or QC at the time to do a review of its culture. And one of the things that came out in that report is customer satisfaction surveys were based on, I think it would, don't quote me on this, but it was something like just 2 months of ownership of the new build properties, where, it took us quite a few years to find out that we actually had a lot of serious latent defects. The only other thing I would say, Sam mentioned Help to Buy. I think that's been proven to aid price house inflation, and also it's contributed quite significantly to developers' profits. So in my view, it's a government initiative that is working against its actual aim. So I'm not very optimistic about the quality. And I think a few years ago, didn't Julie James say something about the industry, that they may be building slums of the future? Because I can't see them lasting like houses have in, as I say, Splot, Whitchurch, Pennyland, you know, those traditional Cardiff kind of suburbs where they've been there for, you know, decades, and they're still solid buildings. They might need some refurbishment, but they're going to be around for a lot longer. So that's my take.
Thank you, Mark. You've done a great job there selling the wonderful Roath area. I'm very glad for you doing so. But again, even in Roath, we can't park that easily. So I'll
No, oh no, I know. Well, that's another podcast.
That's another issue entirely. That's a different podcast, Mark. I'll hand over to Gary now.
It's interesting you talk about Help to Buy. I work with a team that is responsible for that, and it wasn't a policy I gave positive advice on, but I always was in the awkward squad there. But Sam, you know, we're talking around Welsh Government and Welsh Government bespoke legislation or areas of lawmaking in Wales. You know, are there any distinct aspects of Welsh house building? You know, we've got mandatory sprinklers since 2016. There were other things I'm aware of, but never came to pass. But are there anything distinctly Welsh out there?
Oh, distinctly Welsh. Well, that's an interesting one. Obviously, sprinklers is a great example. I referenced earlier things like Welsh housing quality standards, Welsh housing development requirements as well. It's fair to say similar schemes exist in other parts of the UK as well, but these are some quite distinctly Welsh initiatives which sort of help to drive forward a higher level of quality and a higher level of safety and sustainability within these properties. To a degree as well, that sort of helps bridge a gap within that sort of survey, inspection, sign-off piece as well, because you embed in some fundamental quality challenges at the beginning of that process, at that planning and development stage. When I look at some of the things Welsh Government have talked about quite recently, things Vaughan Gething has said in the run-up to becoming First Minister as well, there is a lot of potential. I think it's a good word, but a lot of it, of course, as we've seen over the last few years, to a degree, is hearsay. So for example, Vaughan Gething has said he's going to set up an affordable housing task force. Be interesting to see what does that look like. How does that work in practice? There are one or two similar schemes in England which exist, things like Homes England as well, but we don't have similar in Wales. We know Vaughan Gething as well, in his manifesto, talks about things like rent control, rent reform as well. A lot of challenges to go alongside that, and until we purchased our home, we've been renting until quite recently in Cardiff Bay, it was fair to say. And also some other broader challenges, things like, look, when we talk about new builds as well, we know something that, as First Minister Mark Drakeford was very keen to address. I've noticed he submitted a question, a backbench Senate question, a couple of days ago on vacant land tax as well, looking at that sort of developer profit within the land sale side, which, for the record, in Wales doesn't really exist. There's not really been any evidence of this. And the only country which really has ever trialled that, Ireland, basically just locked themselves into years and years of human rights cases, and nothing has really come off the back of that. So there are a few distinctly Welsh initiatives we're working towards. We are fortunate that it is pretty much all devolved. Almost all aspects of housing is devolved. We've got a housing minister who previously Minister for Climate Change, now the Minister for Housing and Planning, is sort of committed to housing. It was good to hear Julie James at a housing conference recently talking about her sort of recommitment to that 20,000 target. But it will be interesting to see sort of what does the next 5 years look like with the Welsh Government as well.
Mark, I know you're not working in the sector or anything like that, but have you got any views on mandatory Welsh legislation or the way Welsh Government have approached the housing sector?
I have very strong views on how they approach the building safety crisis, and that's one of severe disappointment. And that's just not me, it's many of the people I represent or don't represent, but I speak to regularly in Swansea and throughout Cardiff Bay, and that one of the things that really has kind of disappointed us and confused us is why the Welsh Government has been so reluctant to take a very strong stance against developers over this crisis. Because almost from the get-go, and as I said earlier, I got involved around about 2019, and the development I'm involved was very much at the front of the queue in terms of discovering serious defects. And from the get-go, the position of the minister and the Welsh Government was, oh, this is a commercial matter. We can't really get too involved. It's a matter between leaseholders, the management company, and the developer. But we're here to facilitate if you need some help. And then I think what happened as the rollout of Grenfell grew bigger and bigger in England, and then slowly started to filter through into Wales, I think the Welsh Government started waking up to realise that this was a pretty significant public safety crisis, and then started to get a little bit involved. But even as I speak today, you know, they've stepped back from taking the same approach that, for example, and I never thought I'd say this, the more aggressive approach that Michael Gove has taken in England with the developers. And you know, I'm on record as saying Julie James, the Welsh Government, have adopted what I call a light touch, and to use her own words, collaborative approach with developers in trying to resolve the problem in Wales. And I say that in the knowledge that this is a group of developers who basically ducked and dived, deflected, obfuscated since Grenfell, and they've used past poor legislation to say, well, it's not really for us because you've run out of time, and et cetera, et cetera. So to my mind, they've behaved like I think most victims would say, absolutely appallingly. And it was thankfully, and as I say, I never thought I'd say it, thankfully to Michael Gove in England, when he became housing minister, he basically got his baseball bat out and called developers bluff and said, look, unless you start to step up and start dealing with the consequences of your actions, he went as far to say, I'm going to put some of you out of business. And he then followed that up with the Building Safety Act, which amazingly, I'm sure you're aware, changed the law retrospectively, which is rare for a government to do, and pushed the timeline for claims out to 30 years from, I think, the current 6, I think it is. So that made developments like myself game on for then litigating against developers, whereas up until then, we really were struggling about where do we go, because the law wasn't working to us. And what happened then, Michael Gove in England introduced some elements of his act, which are related to what are called contribution and remediation orders, which give local authorities and fire services very strong powers to go to responsible persons, developers and freeholders, and say, you need to fix these developments and you need to provide a timetable. And I think it was back in the 16th of November 2022, and the Welsh Labour government whipped against that to destroy a cross-party motion that was supported by Plaid, the Lib Dem and the Conservatives, and they stopped the introduction of sections 116, 125 in Wales. So we've sadly been very, very disappointed and are still at a loss to explain why the Welsh Government has been so reluctant to get tough with developers. You know,
without knowing the intricate detail of each of the sort of developer pledges or pacts they've signed up for in Wales, I know sort of earlier conversations with a couple of developers extended from what I guess the Welsh Government were asking for compared to UK government. So the UK government's requirement for developers is retrospective sort of remediation. So where a developer sort of fell short when they initially developed that property or building regulations at that time, to remediate to that sort of degree. Welsh Government, rightfully or wrongfully, said, well, actually, we can look at that sort of retrospective remediation, or we can remediate to current building regulations and building standards per day. And that was a big challenge I think a number of developers faced, actually, partly because in some cases, developers have gone bust in one or two cases, sadly, in Wales, but also that it's pretty much unheard of to actually get somebody built something 25 years ago to tell them there's nothing wrong with the building you built at the time, but you're not compliant with current building regulations. That's where a few developers, from my understanding, sort of pushed back on there. I think the Welsh Government have relented to an extent, which is where this sort of growth in developers signing up I've come from now. So it's coming closer to that English model. But I would also say we've sort of had to urge caution with Welsh Government, some of the approaches they wanted to take, simply from a sort of a capacity and resource perspective, because the reality is fire safety, building safety is so technical. There is only a small handful of experts in Wales. The vast majority of people working on these projects and on these developments across Wales actually live in England, live in other parts of the UK as well. So we need to make sure that a framework wasn't created to an extent that actually developers or fire engineers, fire experts living in Bristol said, actually, no, we're just going to focus on this side of the border, rather than sort of go into Wales, where it's a completely different regime. We're going to have to sort of retrain, understand new legislation. So that sort of devolution challenges was also at the back of mind, let alone as well things like a lot of people working in fire safety. I can tell you, surveyors, for example, who do all the technical training in the world, but then insurers, which sit at a UK level, turn around and say, no, we're not going to cover you for this work. So we then have to rely on people like UK government to come in and underwrite insurers, something Welsh Government can't do, but we are relying on Wales, sort of UK government, to actually take action to allow us to deliver work in Wales, if you follow me.
I'm just trying to get my head around this, because obviously the Welsh Government hasn't shied away from imposing quite a strong regulatory framework about the quality of social housing. Obviously, we've seen the Welsh Housing Quality Standard, but I'm struggling to grasp why they're so reticent to act in a similar manner with the private housing sector. Sam, is it just that they are scared of the developers?
Oh, Mark could probably give you more of a first-hand experience of working with developers and actually sort of their appetite, sort of the conversation they've had with Welsh Government. I would say this, though, that it's something that's come up time and time again when I've spoken to representatives in sort of the owner-occupier housing developer sector or the build-to-rent development sector. There's very little encouragement from Welsh Government for them to actually deliver work in Wales. 20,000 affordable homes, which on the face of it, great, but in reality, it's 20,000 sort of smaller social homes they're building. It's not, the Welsh Government, I think it's realistic to say, probably hasn't got as strong as a private sector house building and housing delivery strategy as we've seen in England, where the 300,000 is almost exclusively within that sort of either affordable or sort of owner-occupier rental sector.
Mark, same question to you, really. Why do you think they're so reticent to act?
It's a fantastic question, and it's one that we often discuss amongst ourselves. There are a couple of theories around it. One is that there is a view that, yes, the Welsh Government is possibly worried that if it goes hard, they'll leave Wales because regime is too tough. To that, we would say, and I think it was Kerry mentioned not too long ago in the podcast, that he mentioned fire sprinklers, which Wales introduced several years ago. Now, when that was muted, I think Carwyn Jones was First Minister, and there's a guy some of you may not have heard of, but he's the multi-millionaire owner, former owner and founder of Redrow. He's now stepped away from the company, but he was then, I think, heavily involved in running Redrow, and he's on record. You can look at it on the web, saying, I've told Carwyn Jones if he introduces sprinklers in Wales, he'll end house building in Wales. You make houses too expensive. They're already expensive and developers will move out. Of course, that just never happened at all. But there's one theory there, that the Welsh Government is afraid, and as we've already discussed, they have a massive need for new house builds. There was another theory, I cannot test the veracity of this, but that there was some areas of land, the Welsh Government owns a lot of freehold land in Wales, and there were some affected developments on that land, and there was a view, would the Welsh Government be liable for remediation bills if they did introduce certain types of legislation. But the other thing I'd say to Sam, my understanding, Sam, is that the English building contract with the developers is exactly the same, almost word for word, as the Welsh Government's contract, minus sections 116, 125. And again, that contrasts with, Julie James' continuous statements that we were doing things differently in Wales. I mean, in England, they signed the contract in April 2023, I think, and the Welsh Government signed the same contract about a year later. So as far as we're concerned, we're 12 months behind, and not for 1 second would we say England is doing a fantastic job, because we know from the developments that we're in regular contact in England that the rate of remediation, as in Wales, is appallingly slow. And 12 months on from signing these contracts, developers are still finding ways to slow things down and not actually get on and remediate, which is what people want. There's just a total lack of urgency. And, for a long time, we've been saying that the only thing developers understand is the law and profit erosion. And we think it's about time, if the pace doesn't pick up, the Welsh Government and the English Government started introducing more sanctions on developers. And the thing that would get their attention is, of course, restrictions on further planning permissions. But there, you'll get Welsh Government ministers sort of saying, well, there are legal issues with that. But, we all know in these matters, it's a question of political will to get things changed. So we haven't been very happy at all with the Welsh Government's response to this crisis.
I think we've looked at the crisis side of things, and Mark, I know it is incredibly personal to you, but I do want to touch on some of the positives or some of the other issues. And Sam, it was a really interesting article written by a friend of the pod, but also a great economist, Calvin Jones, around the problems around retrofit in these kind of circumstances. Do you think he's right about what he was saying in that article about the issues around retrofitting, but we're just not doing enough at the moment?
Yes, it's a simple answer there. We are not doing enough. I already said earlier, 1.5 million existing builds. Wales has some of the oldest housing stock in Wales. And on top of that, not only do we have some of the oldest housing stock, we have some of the most unhealthiest building stock. Not just the physical buildings, but actually people in it. Wales has one of the oldest populations as well, and a lot in these properties. A lot of the most vulnerable people in some of the most in need properties for retrofitting. It's a challenge, not just Wales, but the UK as a whole. How do we upscale en masse retrofitting? And I always use this sort of analogy of the carrot and stick here. You can throw as many grants, subsidies, support you want out there, but at the end of the day, if it's not backed by a form of regulation, a form of stick, it's very little action is going to happen. In the private rented sector, for example, minimum energy efficiency standards was that catalyst for getting landlords to act to improve their property, albeit by a very small margin. And there's a lot more to go. And UK level, Gove has scrapped sort of future these requirements. But again, within Wales, I appreciate Welsh Government very limited budgetary possibilities for sort of large scale retrofitting, but we need to find a way, less so the social housing sector, but more the owner occupier sector, more the private rented sector, for upscaling that. How can we create not just the sort of the carrots, as it were, but actually the regulation, the stick to back it up? And what the Welsh Government do have powers to enable that. But at the same time, we need to make sure we do it in a balanced approach where any regulation is backed up by additional training, additional resource, not limiting people to some of the most expensive products out on the marketplace, or creating what we call trapped assets, buildings where, for example, a landlord, for them, it might just be uneconomical, they say, to move it from an EPC E to an EPC B rating or C rating, then they just sell it. And what happens with that? It goes to an owner occupier who's got absolutely no regulation to actually make them take action either. And I just sort of finish and sort of give hard evidence here. I won't name who the lender was, but we did some work a couple of years ago on retrofitting projects in Wales, and RICS launched our residential retrofit standard, which sort of sets that sort of basis for an inspection of a property for retrofitting. And a lot of our members have been doing work over the last few years in other capacities as well. That lender, as a pilot, wrote to several hundred of their customers in South Wales to say, would you like a free retrofit assessment on your property? Just so you know what's the state of your property, what needs to be done to it. I think, don't quote me on this, I think there was less than 3 or 4 households took up that offer of just a free retrofit assessment, simply because at the time it's not on people's minds. There wasn't a catalyst for that. Things like the energy crisis has pushed people to start thinking more, but I just reiterate that without that sort of regulatory push, it will be a very, very long, drawn-out process. And I would just say this, we need action today. Just last week, Scotland have already delayed the 2030 to 2035 decarbonisation and net zero targets because that action has not happened yet.
I just want to, I know Matt wants to come in on a couple of final questions around leasehold, but I do want to get a bit of positivity into this if we can tonight, because I know, Sam, that you work with, Wales has got some really innovative building companies and people who produce some really good products. There are some good stories out there still, aren't there?
When we look at retrofitting, absolutely. I'd give the Welsh Government credit in this in the optimised retrofit scheme, which admittedly very small in scale, but is still retrofitting several thousand homes. The very early stages, allowing lessons to be learned as well, not just in the right measures to install the assessments of it, but actually bringing the residents with us on this journey as well. And that is a big educational piece happening. We're learning some really important lessons here, how to actually get properties retrofitted at scale here, and how to do it in a good way as well. So we're not creating issues of overheating, damp, mold, etc. Lessons which you hear about in other parts of the country. We're trying to do that right here in Wales, and to an extent, it's working very well. I will also say as well, I have seen some really innovative sort of examples visiting a couple of retrofitted projects across Wales. I want to say it was done by Tata, as in Tata Steel, but don't quote me on this, looking at things like roller solar panels. So rather than really heavy solar panels, which then need roofs to be sort of reinforced, sort of roller ones, ultra lightweight solar, which can be fitted on almost any surface. It's been done in a couple of instances in Wales. We've also got things like new innovative heating methodologies going on, a couple of social housing schemes, I believe in Newport as well. I've forgotten the technical name, is those sort of infra panels which go on the wall as well. Kerry, you might know exactly what I'm talking about here.
I just think there's a lot of innovative stuff out there which is positive, but just gets overshadowed by some of the negatives. I knew you'd worked with some, so I thought it was good to get that on the pod. Matt, did you have a question about leaseholders?
I did, because I thought your positivity was sort of ruining the vibe I'd carefully created throughout the entire pod, which is one of pure misery. We need to talk about leasehold. It is one of the biggest issues relating to property, I think, throughout the whole UK. I think most people by this point view it as a manifest unfairness. And I think your experience speaks to that quite clearly. Would you be able to talk us a little bit about your experience of leasehold in Wales at the minute? And also, just so we can end on something resembling a positive note, which I know Kerry is very keen on. What kind of reform would you like to see in the area as we approach the next general election?
Well, I think the bottom line is that it should go. I mean, not all your listeners might know, but amazingly, it appears that it's only England and sadly Wales. I'm as passionate a Welshman as all you guys. England and Wales are the only two countries in the entire world that maintain this feudal principle of leasehold. And it's been around for decades. I think Tony Blair's government said they were going to get rid of it, and I think it goes before that. Successive governments never have. It, of course, got supercharged by Grenfell because what Grenfell showed to people was what was the liability that most people didn't realize they had by taking on a leasehold development. So what that meant is, pre the Building Safety Act we've been talking about, that the bill for your 25 million cladding building remediation fell on your leaseholder's lap. Yet people would say, but I'm a leaseholder. The freeholder owns the building. And in a lot of cases, the freeholder is a Virgin Islands offshore tax optimization program for multi-billionaires. So that suddenly pushed it back up the list. But basically, it needs to go. And I think as we speak in the last few days, Gove has shifted on ground rates. We're not, I think, going to see the end of it, but I think he's now capping ground rents to £250 for the next 20 years. Because again, one of the things we've been seeing happened in the last decade or so is developers bundling up and selling off the freeholds of their developments to offshore investment purposes vehicles. And they've slowly, because it's been a very loose and lightly regulated sector, they've been engaging in doubling ground rates and tripling. So I've seen ground rates go from, not in my own development, but in London, you read of them going from like 2,000 to 4,000 to 6,000 to 12,000 and projected to go up higher. So I think essentially it needs to go, but it remains to be seen. But there has been some progress. The other thing I wanted to say, my earlier comment, at the end of the day, most people like me hold developers accountable for this fiasco, not the Welsh Government or the UK government. They have a role to play because they set the regulatory framework, etc., etc. But it's ultimately developers who built these things. And in the absence of them stepping up, you naturally look to the government of the day to step in and protect you. Because at the end of the day, the shocking thing about this is the people involved pretty much did everything that was asked of them. In cases, they saved for a deposit, they secured a mortgage, they paid for a survey, and they still got stuffed. And that's a huge piece of social injustice. So we just need to see justice and the developers held to account with urgency, because this can't be allowed to drag on for another decade or so. We're already 7 years post Grenfell, and there's tens of thousands of properties throughout England and Wales that are still awaiting remediation.
Thanks both. This has been a really fascinating conversation, and I want to just put on record our thanks for both of you coming on and for sharing your stories about the sector. If people want to hear more from you, where can they go and find you on socials? Mark?
Welsh Gladiators is pretty much a good one on X. There's also a Facebook for Welsh Gladiators where we try to keep people abreast of various bits and bobs. So yeah, anyone wants to follow us, we'd be grateful for that. Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity.
Pleasure, Mark. Thanks. Sam, what about you?
I'm a bit more boring, I'm afraid. I'm just on LinkedIn. So just search Sam Reason. No doubt you'll find me there. But yeah, please, anybody's got questions, drop me a message on LinkedIn as well. Always happy to engage. And actually, Mark, great example just to finish on that sort of leasehold reform bit. I know Celestia, resident management, sort of company run it as well. I'm doing a hell of a lot of work with that sort of resident management company to understand best practice as well as part of these broader leasehold reforms. So we're really keen to engage with people who've got experience on them and leaseholders as well, and other people who want to learn a bit more about how that sort of whole space can work. So we can advise on sort of that best in practice block management as well going forward. But yeah, just end saying thank you very much again for inviting me along.
Can I just build on Sam's his reticence? But as an ex-employee of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, doing something entirely different but fascinating, you can also look at RICS Wales or RICS News to see what that body, which, like I say, is a big important civic body, does. They're a regulator of an industry as well as a profession. So those options are there to follow if you want to know more about RICS as well.
Thank you for doing the important part, which I forgot to do, is plug my own organisation.
I've got your back, Sam.
He's handy to stuff like that. He's all right.
The check's in the post.
He does all right. But anyway, again, thank you so much to both Sam and Mark for being with us this evening. If you've enjoyed what you've heard this evening, please don't forget to find Hiraeth on all the socials at Hiraeth Pod. You can go to our website, www.walespolitics.com, and thank you so much for supporting us with your ears. But if you would like to do so with your wallet, you can go to www.patreon.com/Hiraeth Pod.
Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.